her. So Dr. Bailey is at Brigham Young University as an associate professor. She does research related to the experience of women and Indigenous people in STEM, among other topics. Definitely relevant to our work in science communication and looking forward to hearing that work now. She did her training at Brigham Young University, taught at Georgetown, and is now back at Brigham Young, doing as a faculty member now. So during the talk, there'll be a chance near the beginning. Dr. Bailey will encourage kind of some group reflection and participation. I'll let her lead that near the beginning, and there also will be a chance for Q&A at the end. So you can post those in the chat or message Erin Rowland Schaefer directly if you want her to share out a question that you might have for the Q&A portion at the end. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. Dr. Bailey, if you want to share your slides, and then we'll get started.
Perfect. Okay, did that come through okay? Everybody can see?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nicole. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to be talking about looking at science communication beyond one lens. And as I talk, we'll figure out what that means. So let's start though. I'm hoping you can all participate in the chat and just put as many ideas as you can think of. What are some different ways that humans can come to know about the world? I'm going to pull that up so I can see them come in. Any ideas you have, any different ways, firsthand experience, senses, science, definitely we're all familiar with that experience, people teaching them, curiosity, direct observation, stories, I love that, reading, trial and error, their own experiences, culture from their peers. Awesome. Yeah, those are great ideas. Oh, wait for a few more. Conversation, questioning, parent. Totally. Those are great thoughts. I'm going to share an embarrassing picture of me. This is me when I was 8 years old. And I just felt, sometimes I show this to my students when we talk about genetics, because I just think, seeing me with the buck teeth just makes me look a lot better looking now. So it's like, look how far I've gotten. But I share this because this is shortly after I had eye surgery, because I had strabismus growing up, which is a lazy eye. Still kind of comes out every once in a while. But basically, my eyes were not aligned. And so they could look different directions. And even now, even after they've been surgically corrected to be more aligned, I still really focus out of a single eye, while most people just naturally focus with both at the same time. And so I still see, like, I'm still sensing things through both organs, but my focus is usually on one. And if I'm going to focus on both, I have to do that very intentionally. And just recently, I've been thinking about that as an analogy of how we look at the world and what eyes we're looking out of. I've just been thinking about how many of our students come to science already seeing the world through multiple lenses, many that you brought up in the chat, cultural lenses, spiritual, relational, experiential, and scientific lenses. But often in science education, and when we're communicating about science, we're asking people to close one eye, often, maybe not intentionally, but we're just wanting us to only look at science, and we're kind of ignoring all the other ways that we look at the world. And the problem is when we do that, the picture just flattens, we lose depth, we risk losing connection that makes the science meaningful to people. And today I want to explore what can happen if we not only acknowledge that these other lenses exist, but we aren't afraid of bringing them into our education and into our communication. So I'm going to kind of make this analogy of different ways of knowing about the world as different lenses. And I give science its own lens, because, that was a big one. People put in the chat, like, we are, probably most of us coming here, we're scientists. I love science. That's what I'm trying to teach to my students and give them a love for science. But they're also coming with so many other lenses, faith, Indigenous knowledge, ethics, relationships, values, culture, experience, all these other things. So here's kind of the roadmap. I'm hoping it's cohesive, because it's kind of a couple pretty different things I'm going to talk about, but I do think they're unified through this theme. First, I'm going to talk about seeing through multiple lenses through some of my research looking at the experiences of Indigenous and specifically Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students on integrating cultural and relational ways of knowing with science and how that impacts belonging, motivation, science communication. And then I want to talk about how this could look in practice for kind of zooming out, not just about Indigenous people, but kind of zooming out broadly and what this could look like if we teach through multiple lenses as well. And just an example class that I've been developing that is nowhere near perfect, but something that I've been really enjoying. So let's start with that first part about seeing through multiple lenses and what some of my research can tell us about. That's just a first comment. So this is looking at Indigenous and Pacific Islander students. I am not Indigenous, and so I don't want to pretend that I'm speaking for Indigenous and Pacific Islander students, but I'm going to use their words in their quotes. This is a lens that, like an Indigenous knowledge lens, is not a personal lens that I have grown up with. And so it's really important to me to understand that lens by asking those students about it. Okay, I hope that this will make sense, but I'm just going to kind of briefly describe 4 different studies that I've done, but then I'm going to present the results kind of all together of what are the big takeaways from all 4 of these. I'm so sorry, I have like a frog in my throat. So I'm going to take a little drink. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these so you at least know where I got my data from, but then we'll look at all of the results together. So as you can see, I have 4 main studies. The first one in the red is going to be focused on Native American students, and then the other 3 with more of a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander focus. So the first one, get my clicker working, there we go, is an interview study. So it's a small qualitative study, only 8 participants, but our goal was not to generalize to all Native Americans out there, but to deeply understand the experiences of these students. So our main question was, how do Native American students, both with and without reservation backgrounds, experience the transition from high school to college STEM? What barriers do they face? What supports do they have? And I'm going to shout out all my acknowledgements along the way. So this is a study primarily done by 3 students. So Brandon Mansfield on the far left is a PhD student. And then Gabrielle Green and Dallin Anderson are 2 undergrads. And this manuscript is in preparation, so they're still working on this, but this has been a really great team of students. They're all Native, they're Indigenous from either the United States or Canada, and they are very passionate about amplifying the experience of these students. So we found students that were Native American and that were either in a STEM major or had been in a STEM major before, and we did some semi-structured interviews with them. Our analysis was like an iterative thematic analysis approach. So we read these interviews many times individually and then coming together as a team and talking about common things that we found, using those common ideas to come up with a code book and kind of iteratively going through the interviews, coding line by line, redefining codes, things like that. And then using those codes to pull out unique combinations of quotes that helped us see all of the information in new patterns, new ways, and then finalized themes. And that's honestly pretty much the same analysis method that we're using for all of our qualitative data. The next one was a survey study, it's a little larger, where we focused on Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander students. We ended up with 70 of those students. This study has been published in CBELSE, so you could go look at that if you're interested. My co-authors on that one were Rebecca Greenall. This was part of her dissertation when she was a PhD student. Kavika Allen is a colleague of mine here at BYU, and he's a psychologist that looks at the experiences of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. And then 2 undergrads, Sierra Nichols and Jose de Alba. And this was a large survey where we had a lot of non-NHPI students as well, but I'm just going to focus on the responses we got from the NHPI students. We asked a lot of survey questions, some of them quantitative, about their science identity, their self-efficacy, belonging in science. I'm going to focus more on the qualitative results of open response items, particularly about the intersection between these students' ethnic identities and their science identities. And again, all of that qualitative data we analyzed through a similar method that I already described. After these studies, the next goal was like, well, let's actually start incorporating some Indigenous knowledge into biology. Let's acknowledge that in the classroom. But like I said, I'm not Indigenous. And so before we did that, Becca and I went to the literature. We wanted to learn from the Indigenous voices in the literature. And so we wrote a review article summarizing that for people like me who aren't Indigenous, but wanted to know practical ways that we could better include these students in the classroom. And so we came up with some best practices from the literature in kind of 4 big categories. I won't go through all the nuances, but the idea of exploring multiple ways of knowing in the classroom can be really beneficial. That goes hand in hand with teaching holistically. So focusing on making connections between topics, drawing from multiple sources of information, and then explicitly including traditional ecological knowledge. So TEK, it's really kind of a Western term that we've used for Indigenous knowledge about the environment. This is knowledge that has been passed down from generations that Indigenous people have learned through really intimate connections with the land. And so the literature suggested that let's explicitly acknowledge and include that in biology classes. And not always easy to do, but really important to include Indigenous experts as you do that. Indigenous people themselves, like I said, instead of me trying to describe what Indigenous people think about something, we want to hear it from their own voices. So the third study, it was an intervention study where we actually implemented some of these things, and we wanted to see how do students experience that. We found that in the literature, there was a lot of suggestions of what to do and not a ton of data on how students respond to it. So these first two suggestions we incorporated into a day in the class where we had an activity about various ways of knowing, which really started off similarly to how we just did in the chat, right? So we talked about what are ways that you know about the world, and talking about how you can't necessarily rank ways of knowing as what's better and what's worse, and that they're just different, and they have different assumptions and different apply in different situations. And then for the second two, we developed a case study. It was like a multi-day activity in the class, framed around this question of what is the water quality of the fish ponds in Hawaii. And students were asked to kind of come up with what interest groups might either have information that would benefit us answering this question, or that might be just have input or stakes that you would want to be aware of. And one of those was local Native Hawaiians and their traditional ecological knowledge. And we incorporated Indigenous experts in that. We had videos of them talking about fish ponds and things like that. So this was a large team effort. So again, this was part of Becca Greenall's dissertation, my PhD student. And then Rin, Eleanor, Miley, Rachel, and Grace were all undergrads helping on the project. Kalai Ellis was a master's student at the time. He's now graduated, but he is Hawaiian, and he had gathered some data on fish ponds and watersheds in Hawaii, and he helped us develop this lesson to incorporate his actual scientific data that they could use. And then Spencer Ingley was faculty at our sister university in Hawaii, where we taught the lesson. Okay, so this team, we had a lot of data from this. We looked at coursework, survey responses, post-course interviews, and we qualitative analyzed what students' experiences were. And so this time we don't only have Indigenous students. We did have 13 Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in our sample, but we also had 51 non-NHPI students as well. We were interested in how this would impact both groups. And then the final one I'll tell you is, again, it's more applying how do students experience when they're explicitly encouraged to look through multiple lenses. This is one that's a little more, that one was just a few days of class. This was an immersive research trip in Hawaii. There were two different cohorts, 2 different summers that they got to go with some of my colleagues to Hawaii on the island of Maui and spend 10 days there. And yes, it was a research experience. They were doing water quality sampling and detecting eDNA, catching and identifying damselfly specimens, but it was also very much integrated with some cultural experiences. So they were actually staying with a nonprofit group of Indigenous people. They worked in the taro fields, so that's what this picture is from. They went and helped in the taro fields and learned about that practice in Hawaii. And they did a lot of other cultural experiences, but also it wasn't just a separate thing on the side. It was integrated with their research experience because the local contacts there were helping them identify important places to sample, and they had their own questions that the scientists were helping to answer. And so me and my students, this is my team for this one. These are all undergrads. So Khalees, Clara, Madison, and Eliza. We interviewed the students and then again, qualitatively analyzed what they said. So 4 pretty different data sets, but they're all kind of surrounding this idea of Indigenous people's perspectives on how they fit in science and what happens when we try to bring in their cultural lenses. So let's talk about what we learned. I should go back. I'm going to use these same colors so you can tell what study the data are coming from, but I'll also remind you at least briefly of what study. So our first big takeaway is that the relationship between these lenses, the science lens or their science identity, and the lens, the cultural lens that these students are looking to see the world, those can be, the relationship between them can be complicated. So some students see these as pretty unrelated. Some students see a lot of conflict between them. Some students see them as very complementary. So it's really diverse. This is from that big survey study where we had 70 NHPI students. You can see the first student here just says, these are just kind of separate. They're both part of who I am. They make me me, so they're both important, but they're separate. This one was interesting to me because they talked about almost this border crossing where they say, I put my science hat on when I'm among those who will listen, and I take it off when those who won't listen are there. It's just kind of like they're choosing what lens to look out of or to speak from, depending on who they're with. And then again, some real conflict there. Actually, quite a few students brought up the telescopes on Mauna Kea, the TMT microscopes or telescopes, excuse me, and talked about how it was a desecration of their values, their beliefs, and invasion of their homeland. So they really saw this conflict. From our Native American interview study, one of the students talked about how her classmates were kind of critical of how she was prioritizing her family, and talked about in her culture, community is more important than anything else. And she didn't feel understood in that way. Again, from the NHPI survey study, we also saw a lot of strengthening. They said, I want to learn about science because of my cultural lens. So they said in my Hawaiian culture, sciences applied to everything, and brought up star navigation, wayfinding, talked about how my mom was born and raised here and Native people try to preserve biodiversity. And they thought that really went well with what they were learning about biodiversity in their science classes. Another student brought up the TMT, the telescopes, but this time it was in a positive way. They said, we interact with science all the time with TMT, with invasive species, and that's what connects me with my community and science. So obviously, this is true of all groups, but Indigenous people are not a monolith, right? They don't all see things the exact same way, and it can be complicated for them. But we can also see that in a lot of ways, their cultural lens is not a liability. It's something that's actually strengthening their interest in science. Along those lines, sometimes this cultural lens can be the motivation that inspires them to pursue science in the first place. So from that same survey, a lot of people talked about going back to help their people. So this student from Tonga was talking about that they saw needs there that they could meet if they studied science. A lot of them also talk about there being a minority of NHPIs in science, but instead of that being a negative for them, it was really inspiring them to get that education, go back and be that representative for the next generation, and also just very explicit connections between their cultural values and science. So they said because of their Polynesian culture and that respect the culture has for the earth, they said respecting the earth makes me want to learn more about it. And they wanted to learn that through science. From our Native American interview study, we saw this too. This is especially true with our students who grew up on a reservation, more so than those who did not grow up on the reservation. Over and over, they talked about going back to the reservation to give back. So this student actually took a Navajo class and learned even more about their background than they knew growing up, and said that really made them want to find ways that they could bring support back to the reservation. Another student talked about kind of their education experience, and talked about there were a lot of teachers that go teach on the res, but they're not Native. And it's definitely different seeing someone who looks like you and comes from where you come from. And so they wanted to go back and be that person for the reservation. Next, when students' cultures and other lenses were respected, we saw them talk about experiencing science as a place of belonging. But the opposite could also be true. If they didn't feel like their culture or their lens was seen or respected, then they felt excluded. We saw this with some of our Native American students that we interviewed. Just talking about a lot of, racism that they faced, or even just misunderstanding and ignorance, saying that a lot of people forget that natives exist. They included professors in that. They don't know what kind of background natives come from. Talked about weird questions they would get from students, that the only thing that came to their mind when they heard they were Native was government assistance and Twilight movies, right? And they didn't feel like they understood who they really were. This was a student that kind of showed the flip side, says, my teachers, I don't know if they know a lot about Native culture, but my history teacher reached out to me first, and that made it easier to express myself. So even just talk about how even professors who didn't understand the background, if they seemed like interested and wanted to learn, that was really meaningful for students. And one of our NHPI students in our survey, so we had a quantitative question as well, like a Likert style, and they noted a lot of conflict between their ethnic identity and their science identity. And that was all because it was rare for them to see someone else who was Samoan in the field of science. So it's, again, not just about if it's disrespected, but just even if it's not seen, if they feel invisible. Now, this next set of quotes is from our students who actually experienced having TEK brought into the classroom. So this is our intervention study where they, again, just as a reminder, learned about various ways of knowing and actually learned how that you could go to Indigenous people to learn more to address problems. And we saw so many positive comments from the NHPI students, either in their reflections or in the post-course interviews. They said, having TEK in the class gave me more encouragement to continue in the field. It made me feel like, oh, I do belong in the science community. And I'm just going to read this last one because I just really love it. It says, I've never considered myself to be a scientist exactly, but I think when you're able to apply science to something that's really relevant to you, you feel more connected to it. I feel very connected to Hawaii and my culture, so it's kind of cool now, the two of them combined together. So again, just having them have other lenses seen and acknowledged really made them feel like they belong. Next, this is all from our students where we actually gave them experiences looking through both lenses, so either in the classroom or through that immersive research experience. We found them just so capable of seeing nuance, right? Like seeing these two lenses as distinct and seeing that, oh, sometimes they can be really complementary and sometimes they really do conflict, but they still found meaning even though it was nuanced, right? So some of these quotes help with that. These are the students that saw it in their intro bio class. They said it's really important to incorporate TEK into our scientific conversations. A lot of modern day science goes deeper than TEK in some ways, but TEK can also answer questions that modern science can't. So they add value to each other, and we need both of them. Looking at it from both perspectives, you get a more well-rounded way instead of just like one way. And groups working together can bridge gaps between different people and their ways of thinking. This was a student that did see some conflict, though. After learning about it in their class, they said that sometimes these may not always be aligned. Like TEK, there might be some cultural beliefs, and then science might find things that it's difficult to reconcile those. And so it was helpful for them to just recognize that it's not always easy to see through different lenses, right? It doesn't always go perfectly together. And then our students who were in Hawaii for 10 days, having this really immersive experience in both, they said they would comment on kind of how they fit together. And they really liked this idea that the locals had knowledge they didn't have. The locals noticed this pond is a little different, but they're not quite sure why. And so it's not science. They haven't looked at it the same way we have, but then we can come in and look at it from a scientific perspective. This trip opened my mind to bigger world issues. There's so much more we can do if we study more than just science. And Native Hawaiians know how to manage the land. There's so much we could learn from these ancient traditions and cultures. And then this last one is just totally from the immersive research experience because a lot of those interviews centered around their experience of was this a positive merging and why? And I was just so impressed with how eloquent they were talking about it. They talked about ethical science communication beginning with respect, listening, and relationship, so that their intention was really important, and also reciprocity was central to their credibility as the scientists. They said the intention of the scientist sets the tone. We went in with good intentions and a lot of respect. These people have had so many government officials and scientists tell them instead of talk with them. They just want to be incorporated into conversations about their home. The locals were really supportive once they understood what we were doing. Some were curious what we were actually doing there. And then the cultural lessons I learned helped me be more motivated to learn why we were there and how we could help them with what the scientists were doing. So again, and some of these students were, about half of them were Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, but about half of them had various exposure to this kind of way of thinking before. Okay, there's so much more. These are such rich data sets, but I was just pulling out some things that I thought would be kind of relevant. I'm wondering if we could go to the chat now and just see. I'm imagining you probably have things I haven't even thought of, but anything that stuck out to you that might be relevant to how we educate students about science communication. I have some ideas on the next slide, but I thought I would get your expert thoughts first of just anything that stuck out to you, particular quote or theme. Just put them in the chat and I'll read them aloud. Everyone's perspective on science matters, not just those we consider to be scientists. I love that. Yeah. Good one. Thanks, Eleanor. Teaching students about the relevance of different ways of knowing can help them communicate in ways that bring more people into science rather than push them away. I love that. Like we want, if our goal is to spread science and spread good information, we want it to be welcomed instead of pushed away. We should tell students from dominant cultural backgrounds how people of these other groups feel when their culture isn't included or is included in conversation, so they know how to include these cultural synergies when communicating about science. So good, Nicole. Let's see, understanding the potential disconnect that others may feel between science and their experiences. Yeah, I think that's really important because I think some people just never experience that disconnect. We all come from different backgrounds, right? And so if you've never experienced that disconnect, it might not even be on your radar that the person you're communicating with might feel conflict with what you're saying. It's exciting to see how adding cultural perspectives can increase the value that students give to the content we're trying to convey. Yes, like sometimes it doesn't detract, it makes it more meaningful to students. They're more likely to be interested in what we're talking about. Cultural experiences can influence scientific knowledge. Yeah, sometimes we think they are definitely separate in maybe they're like the epistemology and the assumptions, but if we try to separate them, we're kind of ignoring that important influence. That's great. Yeah, I just had a few, as I was thinking about the kind of takeaways, I thought about the importance of affirming plural identities and ways of knowing, creating that space for students to bring their different cultural, relational, experiential knowledge into the communication. Teaching communication as relationship, not transmission, like that student talking about they're used to being talked at instead of talked with. So emphasizing listening, reciprocity, and care, not just clarity and persuasion, I think is sometimes what we're really focused on, being really clear and persuasive. Integrating that epistemic pluralism and humility. I haven't always been the most humble when sharing scientific information. I'm like, this is what the science says, but we need to have that humility of noting that there can be contradiction between different knowledge systems, and those other knowledge systems can be really meaningful to students. And so we need to approach that with care. Centering place, context, and ethics. Like I said, our intervention, we were really talking about fish ponds in Hawaii because we were in Hawaii, but what's meaningful to your audience, right? Or the audience that your students are communicating with, and centering it on that land, that history, that community. And just to communicate belonging, I think that came up in the chat too, but not like maybe it was Liz that said instead of we don't want to push them away, we want to bring them in. And so representation matters, respect and inclusion are really science communication, and they show that science is for everybody. So just some things we could take away, and that's just kind of almost like a case study on Indigenous students specifically, but I think we could probably find common threads if we looked at other groups who are not always represented. Let me just check out the chat, see if I missed anything. Thinking about the local community can be experts, thinking more about the scientific process itself. How is that different or similar to Western science if you think about Indigenous ways of knowing? That's great. Okay, so now I want to kind of zoom back out. So this is not about Indigenous students specifically. This is just kind of more broadly as I've been thinking about this and looking at how different groups respond to science. I wanted to integrate this into my classroom, and I'm no way claiming this is a perfect way to do it or it's the way, but just an example, maybe get you thinking of how we could do this in our classroom more and how this could look in practice. So just to kind of give you kind of I don't know, a little timeline of how my teaching has evolved and this idea of bringing multiple lenses into intro bio. I think it was 2019-ish. I don't have an exact date, but there's kind of like a before and an after. I used to very much focus on the one lens, like I am your science teacher. And so just as an example, like if I'm introducing a climate change unit, I might say, I know that the topic of climate change can bring up a lot of political questions, but in this class, we're going to focus only on the scientific questions. Like, what can science answer? And so I'm also explicitly shutting down every other lens, even though they're very present for students. And then I went through kind of a phase. Actually, Liz, I still have a vivid memory of us chatting at Sabre, and this specific example came from you. This idea of I started to say other things, at least acknowledging other lenses. So I started saying, like, you can accept scientific evidence that humans cause climate change, and you could still choose to do nothing about it because there's competing priorities, values, or identities that matter to you. So I think that was better because I was at least acknowledging other lenses and helping students. Um, like they were bringing it anyway, and so I was acknowledging that, right? But then this since 2023, I just had the great chance. My university invited me to just pilot a new type of general education course that was focused on big problems, and I took this opportunity to try and do this full integration of let's do the whole class about multiple lenses and focused on science because that's the lens that I'm an expert in, right? Teaching students how to look through the world through a scientific lens, but very much inviting them to bring all their other lenses with them. So I'm going to just kind of share what that class is like, and then we can take questions. So just as some context, so I'm teaching at a private religious institution where we're actually very encouraged to look at content through a religious lens. So my students are used to doing that, which is one benefit. And that's also, I guess I didn't say on my last timeline, I was used to doing that with topics like human evolution and religion. So that was at least some practice that I'd had. But this class is for first year non-major students, 3 credit hours. And this is my third time teaching. I'm teaching it this semester right now. And this picture is actually from that class last year. So this is the second iteration class. Those are my students right there. So it's been a small class in the past. This time it's about 50. So it's gotten a little bigger, but still not huge. So we basically divide the class into 4 chunks. The first topic, the first fourth of the semester, we're talking about human evolution and talking about how we look at how organisms originated. But we definitely talk about the science, like undiluted science lens, all about evolution and that. But we invite students to bring in their religious lenses and how that impacts how they think about this topic. And we wrestle with that together and talk about it in nuanced ways. We talk about climate change, and we explicitly invite them to think about climate change is a pretty big topic. What are the science questions? What are the other questions that science can't answer, but different people will have different priorities, different values? We do a lot of emphasizing that it's usually not good values versus bad values, but really mostly a shared set of values that we prioritize differently because there are trade-offs in complicated questions and you can't make everything optimal. And then we do vaccines for the third set and talk about the science of vaccines. And then also what other questions or values might come into play when you start talking about mandating vaccines or things like that. And then the last fourth of the semester, they get to choose their own topic to do the same kind of work in. So I just want to highlight, even from the birth of the class on my learning objectives, I just want to highlight a few things I have right in there, like integrate different ways of knowing, identify which aspects of an argument are or should be grounded in science. And we talk about communicating in different ways. And there's still a lot of science in there, right? It's judicious interpretation of evidence. They have to have evidence for the things that they're talking about when it's a science question. But we also talk about being peacemakers and having effective communication skills to respectfully engage diverse perspectives with humility and evidence-based understanding. So basically we have a lot of practice communicating. I can't tell you about the whole class, obviously, but we have some assignments where the goal is to understand each other rather than to persuade each other. So they do some more individual writing assignments where they have to talk about their perspectives, but being very clear, like what lenses they're bringing. This is just a good chance to bring up, my students are diverse. Like if I have an Indigenous student in the class, for example, I want them to tell me how that impacts their view rather than me assuming I know, right? So they're the ones bringing in those other lenses rather than me explicitly. I've been trying out a new AI chatbot this semester. It's been kind of cool. It's called Sway, and it pairs them up with someone who disagrees with them in the class, but they chat on their phone or their computer, but it moderates. So as they're typing, if they say they're about to type, well, that's idiotic, it will pop up and say, maybe you could say this a softer way or something like that. And then if it's getting really unproductive, the bot will show up where they can both see it. And it's almost like the little group therapist, like, I think so and so is really valuing this here, and so is worried about this. And so my students, it's funny because when I try, like, how is it? They're kind of like, oh, it's kind of weird. But then if I do anonymous polls, they all want to do it again. And they think it's really good practice. Near the end of the semester, we do more face-to-face practice in groups structured. I don't know if you've heard of living room conversations, but it's a like a nonprofit group that comes up with guides that help people talk about just controversial topics in a productive way. And then their final, they are presenting to each other. So that's a good practice in communicating. So I want to share what that final project is. So they have to choose their own question. And my requirements are, I call them complex questions because it can't be a pure scientific question, like what causes cystic fibrosis? It needs to be more complex in that science does address parts of it, but there are other questions like that science couldn't address. And I'll show you some examples in a second. Then students answer the science-based part. So they're going into the peer-reviewed literature, they're finding answers to their questions, but then they're also considering their own values and what they prioritize, their own context, if there's any intersections between their values and science, and they make a personal decision, like I would do blank. But then I make them go through the same process. Okay, if somebody picked the opposite choice as you with the same science, so it's an intelligent person, why might they choose something different? Like, what are the trade-offs that they would be considering? What would they be prioritizing? Or what might their context be different than your context? And then they present those posters to each other. So just as some examples, sometimes they're very controversial, sometimes they're not very controversial, but they're always fun. So they pick these. So a student picked, would I take Accutane? And so the science that she was looking up are like, what does it work? Are there side effects? And they have to use peer-reviewed literature to answer those. But then they look at their values and look at like, am I valuing quality of life, safety, independence, mindfulness, the cost? And then they, on one side, they're like, what are my values and how could somebody come to the opposite decision as me? She said, I would take Accutane, but maybe someone different than me wouldn't for these reasons. Here's someone about looking at would I consume energy drinks, looking at are they safe? What are the benefits of caffeine? What are my values and how am I prioritizing those? And what context am I coming from? What is my culture? What did I grow up doing? And how could somebody have a different context than me? Maybe they have a sleep disorder and something like that. They come up with other contexts. Say, why would somebody do this? We had somebody do, would I take birth control? Or would I change my diet to be vegan or vegetarian for the reduced carbon emissions? And how would someone pick something different than me? So I really need to gather some more systematic data about this and how it's impacting students. For now, it's pretty anecdotal. I just have the comments that they give on their final student ratings that are anonymous, but I just love reading some of these. Like, she taught us to use our new gained knowledge to help others rather than use in an argument. We learned how to have understanding and respect for others with different opinions, how to have respectful conversation. She facilitates conversations in ways where we know she won't judge us for our responses, even if it's our personal opinions. She's very open-minded and not afraid to share her own personal beliefs, which I find admirable. Just a lot about learning how to discuss things with people who think differently than me and see them as people that I could love, and how to have respect. So it's a class that I really love. Just yesterday, we finished all of the evidence for how climate change is human caused. And I remember one student just, I have never seen this before. Should we be worried? And just so sincere and just taking it all in, but having a very explicit conversation about what my goals were and even drawing it on the board. Like, I do want, if I'm transparent, I want you to be here on this like axis of do I think climate change is caused by humans? Like, transparently, yes, I want you to think that because that's what the data points out. But this other axis of like, should we mandate this or should we do this? I was like, science can't tell you where to fall on here. That's where you're going to have to bring in your personal values. So just kind of sum everything up. Hopefully you saw a common thread among all of this. But if we look at my research, we know that when students' multiple ways of knowing are recognized and included, they experience greater belonging, motivation, and connection to science. And when students can practice integrating these perspectives, their own multiple lenses, and then also trying to be in somebody else's shoes and see how they look at the world, um, they can do that, right? They can practice that. They can use evidence, context, and values to address really complex issues. And so I just think that this demonstrates that science communication education can be more inclusive and effective when it explicitly values that epistemic diversity. I'm not saying that means we don't teach science, right? Or we don't communicate science. Like that is a lens that I really value. But if we have that diversity and we acknowledge those other lenses and focus on relationship and reflection, I think it will be more productive. So yeah, just with that, I just want to acknowledge funding. So Becca's dissertation was funded. She had a GRFP from the NSF, and then I've had a lot of internal funding from my institution to pay all these undergrads to do all the amazing work that they do. And so there's all of my collaborators pictures one more time. And yeah, I'm just excited to hear your questions and your thoughts and learn from you all as well. So
Thank you so much, Liz. What a really phenomenal presentation. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I am going to drop a link in the chat, and you can go to that link and write down questions that you have for our speaker. And then any questions that she doesn't have time to get to during our 15-minute Q&A time, we will work to get addressed. We'll share a list of the questions with Liz to answer, and I can send out the answered questions alongside the recording of today's talk.
yeah, let me answer this one in the chat while people are noting others. So I might have missed this, but during those discussions with students, do they share solutions through their Indigenous lens for climate change, vaccines, etc.? I wasn't paying super attention when you typed that, but I don't know which discussions you're talking about, but maybe is Geoffrey here? Do you want to clarify which discussion?
Yeah, so you mentioned that the students, you talk about climate change in as a topic, you talk about vaccines, and you talk about, sorry, I forgot the third one. And the students,
Evolution, yeah.
yeah, and so when they share, so during the discussion, do they share solutions? Here's one way to look at it. Maybe this could be a way forward. Is that something that you've looked at and try to?
Yeah, sometimes they do. We have a lot of class discussions, and as you probably have experienced, some students are more willing to speak up during a whole class discussion than others. So I've definitely had students that, will definitely speak up and they're not afraid to bring up their own context and say, I think we should do this. And we practice that as a class. Like, even if they're giving a solution you don't agree with, we're like, oh, yeah, why do you think that's important? What are you valuing there? A lot of that comes also in some of their writing assignments. They reflect for me. It's a little bit less scary for some of our shyer students to share their opinions about things. I probably go overboard, but I'm always emphasizing in the reflections that I'm not looking for them to agree with me. And I
Yeah.
want to just hear what they really think. So I still have students say, I still don't think humans really evolved, or I'm still unsure climate change is caused by humans. And then they'll bring up their other lenses. Like, I'm still nervous about how this intersects with my faith, or my family just really doesn't think this is true. I don't know. Does that make sense? So probably some of
Yeah.
that also comes up more
Yeah, yeah. I
privately.
think I think that's really cool. I mean, those discussions would be super valuable, and you're doing such cool work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and then Lisa, have you thought about potentially collecting data on how these activities have impacted their can't talk, real world communication? I would love to see that, Liz. I haven't done anything like that yet. I want to start gathering some more data now that this class is better developed. I started kind of having some assignments where I asked them to now go out and have a discussion um with a family member or friend about climate change. And we did that once. And I think my assignment description wasn't right because it wasn't super meaningful. And that was my first iteration. And then I abandoned it, and I need to bring something like that back in and actually gather data about it. I think that would be really cool. Let me look at some other questions here. Have you encountered conflict with your students when presenting their posters? when a student feels like something is misrepresenting a perspective that they hold. So at least so far, I have had zero problems. I was kind of surprised. And I've had more controversial ones. I had a student do, would I get an abortion? Which can be a hot topic at a religious institution like mine. And I had zero issues. And I think part of it is how much we emphasize that the person on their poster, the other person has to be, they could always almost chant this by the end of the session. I'm like, think of them as someone equally good and intelligent as you, but just coming from a different perspective. And even the first time I did it, I had this woman in my class just be like, no, like she was thinking about a specific thing in her mind. I can't think of someone as equally good. But we like practiced that. And I haven't had any issues, partly because we have some drafts that we look at and I try to get feedback on how they're representing other people. Not saying we never will, but at least so far, we've done this. We'll see how this one goes. It's a little larger class this time, so you never know. We'll see how that goes. How do you approach the actual content teaching on science when students may disagree about the facts themselves? So, I mean, we just present the science as it is, like in any class. So we just finished a couple weeks going, well, maybe it's just 1 week on all of the evidence that climate change is occurring and that it's human caused. And I do have so many students that by the end of the unit say, wow, I didn't think this was a real thing. And now I've seen the data. Like, we don't dilute that in any way. On their posters, they're required to represent accurate science. So the disagreement, I emphasize, is coming down to just differing values and context. So even if they disagree, they're at least not allowed to misrepresent science on their posters without getting, deducted on their grade. In the context of your work, how do you define science communication? When I saw science communication education, I thought about how to communicate science in informal spaces, but I'm sensing you were talking about teaching science in formal spaces. Yeah, and I will just be honest that my work did not begin as science communication education framed in exactly that way. I think that I have been focusing on how am I communicating science and how am I teaching science to communicate about science to each other. And I think the next step in what I do to kind of address what you're talking about and kind of bring out what Liz said is now I want to start trying to see, can they take these skills outside the classroom? And I think that would be definitely an important follow-up to my work. Have you thought about potentially collecting data on how these activities have impacted their real world communication? Oh yeah, we answered that one. How might modern scientific knowledge / biology knowledge be challenged by Indigenous knowledge systems? Yeah, so this is a great question. I wish I could think of an exact example off the top of my head. When Becca was doing her whole dissertation, I actually remember a whole discussion about this in one of her defenses, because she was always emphasizing the compatibility. And one of her committee members, really pushed back with a specific example that I can't remember now about, a cultural belief about some organisms that just does not hold up to scientific testing. So I think there's sometimes, whether it's Indigenous knowledge or religious ideas about things, that they conflict with scientific evidence, right? That happens all the time in faith traditions and evolution and the way that, Indigenous people sometimes think about organisms. So I wish I had like a very specific example for you with Indigenous, but it's not coming to my mind. Okay. I have learned some about the idea of indigenizing the academy or incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into Western scholarship often oversimplifies the complexity of Indigenous knowledge. How do you encourage students to bring their other lenses into the classroom without inherently becoming reductionist? That's such an important comment. The review article I shared, I don't know who commented this one, but if you're interested, we have a much more thorough discussion about that in that paper that you could go read to expand on what I'm about to say. But that's definitely a concern. Like I said, even the term traditional ecological knowledge is really a Western term that scientists have come up with to kind of neatly package Indigenous knowledge. And there are for sure a lot of, dangers of trivializing Indigenous knowledge, of tokenizing it. I think the easiest way not to do that is to not, like, I never try to say this is what Indigenous people think. I just find resources of Indigenous people speaking. In the intervention we did about ways of knowing, we included a whole discussion about your comment. We had some quotes from author or a paper where the author was really arguing against including Indigenous knowledge in classrooms and what the dangers might be. So we just had a really frank discussion about it in that class of what the benefits are and what the dangers are. There's so many Indigenous people I found in literature saying, yes, this is a great idea. And I've also seen Indigenous people saying, please don't do this and try to like fit our knowledge into your system. So I think it's a hard thing to, it's a hard question. I wrestle with this too, even just doing research on this as someone who is not Indigenous, and I wrestle with that, and I try to include Indigenous students whenever I can. And a lot of the studies that we have done have been motivated by my Indigenous students wanting to ask the question. So I don't have a great answer for you other than it's a really valid critique, and I really am glad that you brought it up. Are you willing to share any materials? I'm happy to share anything. Yeah, like I said, it's not perfection and I'm always tweaking it, but if you just want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat. You email me, I'll send you anything you want. And okay, have you thought about exploring how students experience this aspect of the project, especially how they feel when they're asked to reflect on and navigate conflicting values? It'd be really interesting to see whether this process challenges their thinking, deepens their self-awareness, or perhaps even causes some discomfort that leads to meaningful learning. Yes, there's so much data I need to and want to gather. Like I said, so far, it's all been very anecdotal of like the results of this new course design. So there's a lot of research that I want to do to actually see, yeah, how students are experiencing it. Even just like I've mentioned this student when this is near the beginning of the semester, this iteration. And I said, at the end of the semester, you'll be considering how somebody equally good and intelligent as you could pick the opposite thing. And I had this one student especially just pushing back because she was so passionate about her opinion about, she couldn't even imagine how to get in the shoes of somebody on the other side. So I would actually be really interested just to talk to her specifically at the end of the semester. And if it changed her mind at all, not like much changed her mind about what her opinion is, that's not my goal necessarily, but just if it changed her opinion on whether you could see that person, you know, as a good human that thinks differently than you do. I think that would be interesting to do that. So I definitely want to do some follow-up studies and interview some of these students about their experience. So yeah, so apologies that the second half of the talk didn't have good solid data behind it, and maybe just ideas that you could consider as you're incorporating things into the classroom. Yeah, did I miss any, Erin, that you noticed?
Everything that I have seen looks like it has been answered. We have a couple more minutes, so if anybody wants to either, unmute and ask a question, drop another question in the chat or in the form, you're welcome to do so. And in the meantime, I will also share my screen. So many of you are already signed up to receive notifications about upcoming events from our network, but I wanted to give you the opportunity, if maybe this is your first time joining us for a talk series, if you'd like to sign up so that you receive notifications about upcoming events, we'd be incredibly happy to have you. And I also want to plug that this is the first talk in our fall series, but our next talk will be on November 13th, and we'll hear from interpersonal communications researcher Dr. Mira Fa on conflict resolution. So feel free to sign up to stay in the loop. And feel free to, oh, look, more questions are coming in. Yay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi. It's fun to see people I saw at SCERN. Okay. Have you thought about how you might scale the activity that you ran with your students? I wonder if these conversations are a little bit more accessible when you have relationships with all your students. Super good question. So yeah, the first two iterations, I only had 25 students. This semester I have 50. And I've already just noticed it being a little bit harder, like feeling a little less connected to my students, a little less dialed in to what they're all thinking. Like in my first couple iterations, I pretty much knew everybody's political leanings and, who would be worried about what I was about to say. And I could look at them when I said something very intentionally about like, and if you're conservative, like you can be conservative. I don't know. I could be very intentional, and it's harder the bigger the class. Some ways I've tried to do that as I ramped up. So my institution is nice in that I get a TA for every 30 students at least. So my TAs read through all of their reflections for me, and then they give me a sub list of ones that they think I should read. So students that are feeling the most conflict or changing their mind the most, I just kind of things, so I can still have a pulse on the class and be aware of students that might be feeling the most conflict. It's not a perfect thing, but I'm still able to know the students quite well because of that. Yeah, and then the poster session, I'm already trying to figure out because I usually see every poster, and it's going to get harder the bigger the class gets. So totally good question, and I'm still kind of figuring out how to do that. And then, yeah, I don't think Emily had a question, but thanks for your comment, Emily.
Thank you all again so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our next talk. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.